Okay, so at this point, you should have already watched the lecture on Paleolithic art, and you should have watched the first lecture on Neolithic art, where we were talking about things like Stonehenge in Western Europe. And today, we're still going to be in the Neolithic time period, but we are going to be further east. So we're going to be over in what's known as the Fertile Crescent, which is kind of takes up a large area of space in what is now Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. All right, so we're going to look at this region, and this is another rapidly developing, the most rapidly developing region during the Neolithic period. It's called the Fertile Crescent. The region is sometimes also called the birthplace or cradle of civilization. And that's not by accident. This is where a lot of things that we associate with contemporary civilization, culture, society, that kind of thing, originated. So we're going to talk about this. Sometimes this period is called the Neolithic Revolution, kind of in kin with the Industrial Revolution much later in the 19th century, where so many things are rapidly advancing and changing that it gets sort of coined as this like revolution because it's such a big shift in culture. So this is the shift from the kind of hunter-gatherer nomadic type life of the Paleolithic peoples that we talked about, the Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens. And this is shifting into a more stable, more agriculturally based life. So the farmer, the herder, again, more an agriculture sort of based life. And the reason this is important to us in terms of art history and architectural history is we now have people staying put. We have people staying in the same area long enough to do things like build homes and invent money and writing and laws. And so we see all of this rapid cultural development at this time because we have stability. And throughout this class, we'll look at many different periods of time, and you'll notice that the most rapid cultural developments happen during times of peace, times of stability, when there's time to invest back into culture and into society rather than going out like having to find food because you're starving, you're gathering, or waging war against other societies. Okay, so this big change comes first to what we call Mesopotamia. Maybe some of you have heard of Mesopotamia. I feel like it's a fairly known thing. It gets represented in pop culture from time to time. And where does this word come from, Mesopotamia? You know me at this point, I like to tell you what words mean. So this is a word that's Greek originally, and it's a Greek word meaning the land between rivers. Greek is one of the languages I took in college, and I don't get to use it that often, but in this class I do. So Mesopotamia in ancient Greek means the land between the rivers. Why is that what this area is called? Well, if you look at my map here, you see that there are two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which are very important, very historically significant rivers, in that they create this sort of fertile crescent, as we've called it, this area of good agricultural land in the middle of what we now call the Middle East. So it's good for things like farming. And again, with farming and agriculture in that development, we get stability. So the Greeks refer to this area as this land between the rivers because that's kind of why it was able to exist. Okay, so again, this is Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and if we're looking at contemporary society. In the 19th century, present era, people start excavating and discovering these prehistoric and ancient societies and evidence of these societies. So they start, archaeology, we'll talk about this later in the semester, but archaeology really, I don't want to say it becomes trendy, but it kind of, if it was in contemporary times, we'd say it was trending at the time in the 19th century. People get really into it and start discovering all of these evidences of early societies that people thought were mythical or thought didn't actually exist. So one of the major discoveries is the ancient city of Ur. Ur is spelled U-R, so if you're using texting language and instead of saying your, you say U-R, I will think you're talking about an ancient Mesopotamian city, so don't do that, or I'm kind of joking, but really that's what it always makes me think of if I see a text like that. Okay, so one of the major discoveries at this time is the city of Ur, which leads to a lot of study of the Sumerian people. Okay, so the Sumerian people are the people who populated the city of Ur and the surrounding area in Mesopotamia at this time. Before the Sumerians, the Fertile Crescent was pretty sparsely populated. There weren't very many people living there. Again, it was part of this nomadic kind of lifestyle that we saw in the Paleolithic period. But the Sumerians are really who invent agriculture and who make the development of stable society possible. So they're a pretty important group of people. We're going to talk about them a lot today. And the area specifically that the Sumerians inhabited is what is today southern Iraq. So if you're trying to ground yourself geographically, we're in southern Iraq right now. Around 3400 to about 3200 BC, we also see the Elamites, which is kind of in what's now Iran, the Elamite people from the city of Elam, E-L-A-M. They start developing writing, and that's about the same time that the Sumerians also start developing writing. So both civilizations get kind of credited with the invention of writing. But it begins with pictograms, which are very similar to hieroglyphics, which we're going to talk about in our next lecture when we talk about Egypt. But you all kind of know what hieroglyphics are, little pictures. They're kind of like a serialized cartoon, like a comic strip of images that show a narrative, that tell a story of something happening in time as it goes across time. So first we have these pictograms as the earliest form of writing in both Sumerian and Elamite culture. And then this develops into something that's called cuneiform. So you may have heard of cuneiform. You need to note it now because it's going to be one of your vocabulary words. That's C-U-N-E-I-F-O-R-M, used in spelling bees a lot, cuneiform. Okay, so cuneiform is the earliest form of writing where instead of just having pictures that represent things that are happening, like you want to talk about your goats, so you're drawing little pictures of goats, for example. Goats were big at this time. There are these sort of wedge-like shapes that become symbols that represent words or equivalent letters. So this doesn't sound like a crazy concept to us. We all know what writing is. This is the first time this has ever happened. So it's a very radical new concept, this idea of writing. And because of writing and because of all of these lovely archaeologists and scholars we know quite a bit about these people because we have some written records. So we're now getting into what we call ancient civilization rather than prehistoric. Does anyone know the distinction there? Okay, well, let's look at the word prehistoric. Prehistory means pre-writing. Okay, so if something is prehistoric, it means it existed before written language. So now that the Sumerians are on the scene, we're in the ancient realms, not prehistoric realms. Okay, so ancient Sumer, where the Sumerians live, they live in Sumer, S-U-M-E-R, is not a unified country, okay? It's not kind of like we think of now, we're the United States, we have a president, we're unified, this kind of thing. It's really just a group of what were called city-states, so small areas of population that rule themselves, but they have enough of a relationship with each other in this region that we sort of loosely classify them as Sumer. So this is about a dozen city-states at this time. And each of them has their own deity, their own god or goddess that rules their city. That is their person that they worship and that they believe is their supreme guiding being kind of situation, okay? So, and the belief is that each city-state has a ruler that is selected by that deity, okay? Because of this belief that each city was the purview of a god or goddess, the city planning revolved around the temple. Okay, so we see, again, buildings are being built because people are staying put because of agriculture. And then one of the things that we see being developed are these religious buildings or temples. Okay, and the temples tend to be the grandest, the largest structure in the civilization, and they also tend to be centrally located. Okay, so literally the city planning revolves around the temple, which is the house of this deity. So their society is very much based around worship and this particular entity that governs them. So this image, let's get to the image now. That was a lot of history, sorry, just kind of placing you where we are. So this image is what we call the White Temple. It's called the White Temple because at the time of its construction, the outer facades of it would have been nice gleaming white polished limestone. It's been worn down over many, many thousands of years at this point. But this is called the White Temple. It's at a city called Uruk, which is modernly, it's in Iraq, and the city in contemporary times is called Warka, but in ancient times it was Uruk. Okay. This is a super well-preserved example of a temple. So most things from this time period, we're talking, this is 5,000 years ago, we just have the foundational lines literally in the sand remaining of the sort of the stones that were the grounding foundation of these temples. This one you can see, this is an actual structure. And a lot of it is still intact. It's not perfect, it's not beautifully preserved, but it's pretty well preserved considering how old it is and considering the rough climate in which it's located. Again, this is in modern day Iraq, right? So this is a desert climate. Okay, so this is the home of Gilgamesh. Does anyone know who Gilgamesh was? Anybody? Sometimes Gilgamesh is one of those iconic figures that makes it into pop culture and people understand who that is or have some knowledge of who that is. So Gilgamesh, the Sumerians, who we said invented writing, they also produced literature. And the best known example of their literature is called the Epic of Gilgamesh, okay? And he was a king, he was a legendary king, and he was the king of this city, Uruk, which is where the White Temple is located. And he is legendary because he slayed a monster called the Huwawa, Huwawa, the Huwawa. It was this giant creature. It had horns in some depictions, but it was this giant that was thought to be like a creation of the gods, or some legends, an offspring of the gods. Anyway, it was attacking his city, and so Gilgamesh goes and defeats this monster, and they write this epic about him. Okay, so this is his home temple. This is where Gilgamesh is from. And so it's pretty rad that we can see this much of the temple and get a good idea about what it looks like. So let's take a peek at a drawing. We know the temple was on a high platform called a ziggurat. In this case, the ziggurat was 40 feet tall. Ziggurat is another vocabulary word you're going to need to know. This is a type of massive structure that's built in ancient Mesopotamia. There are similar things built in other areas in what's now the Middle East, and it has the form of a terraced compound of successively receding stories or levels, like you can see in this illustration. So this particular temple, the White Temple, was probably dedicated to Anu, A-N-U, and that's the god of the sky at this time for this culture. The temple had a central chamber, which is called a cella, C-E-L-L-A. That's another word you're going to want to know, which housed the altar and was kind of reserved for the priests or priestesses who were going in to serve this god. Okay, then there would have been other chambers around the outside that regular people could have gone in to worship as well. Okay. This is a pretty fantastic piece from this time period. I can't see this and not think of Frida Kahlo. Frida Kahlo, if you want to know more about who that is, she's a Mexican surrealist from the 20th century. You have to take my other class, art history, too. But she's very iconically famous for her unibrow. This marble sculpture has a unibrow as well, so it makes me think of Frida. It's not Frida. This marble head is made out of white marble, which is not a native stone to this area, so it would have been very expensive to import, so we know this was something very important to be carved out of white marble at this time. And it's really interesting because it's fairly realistic in terms of its proportions. The eyes are a little large, but in terms of facial proportions, it's fairly realistic. Think back to the Paleolithic sculptures of women that we were looking at, and this is kind of light years ahead, right? This is much more naturalistic and representing reality, right? So that's very ahead of its time. The other thing that's interesting about it is this was it's almost like a mask, and it had holes on the back, so most likely there was a whole sculpture of the woman's body that this was then attached to, so just the face part was carved out of marble. It's unknown, the rest of the sculpture has been lost to time, but it's pretty interesting. And the thought is that this probably portrays Inanna, I-N-A-N-N-A, and this is the Sumerian goddess of love and war. So she's a very important figure in their mythology. And it's pretty likely that something of this costly material would be in honor of this important goddess in their culture. She's also known by another name. Her other name is Ishtar, I-S-H-T-A-R. So she kind of comes up a lot when we're looking at Persian art and architecture. So we'll hear about Ishtar or Inanna later in this lecture. It's also thought that the Sumerians were the earliest people to use pictures in terms of a narrative. Okay, now if you think back to my Paleolithic lecture, you're going to say, but Megan, wait, we saw those incredible cave paintings that you told us were probably narrative. Yes, this idea has been challenged in recent years, particularly in those cave paintings we saw that were discovered in Indonesia that look like they're narrative and telling a progressive story. But definitively, and for a very long time, it was thought that the Sumerians were the first people to do linear narrative pictorial representations, okay, that tell a story, and I always liken it to a comic strip, right? So you have a frieze or a horizontal band of pictures, and the same figures are shown at different points in time, so you can see the completion of an action or a story. And so we know for a fact, there's speculation that some of these early Paleolithic parietal art examples are narrative in nature, but we know for a fact that this Sumerian vase found at Warka is in fact narrative in nature. Okay, so this is definitely very early, and there maybe an argument can be made for some of the Paleolithic stuff being actually the earliest narrative, but we know this guy is. So let's take a peek at it. So this is a vase that's often referred to in academic writing as the Warka vase. Again, Warka is the contemporary city in Iraq, which was in ancient times called Uruk. And so here we see a clear effort at storytelling. This is the first great work of narrative relief sculpture that is known, and we can say that for sure, right? Because this is not a parietal wall painting. This is a relief sculpture. What does relief mean? It means if you put a piece of paper up to it, rubbed it with a crayon, you'd get an imprint, right? It means it sticks out from the surface a little bit. So this is low relief, meaning it doesn't stick out very far, but rather than just being painted on, it's been carved into the space. And this depicts a religious festival in honor of the goddess Inanna, which is why I put these two next to each other. So the narrative is divided into horizontal bands, which we also call friezes. And frieze is a word that's going to come up again. It'll be a vocabulary word a little later when we talk about Greek temples, because the frieze is one of the components of the pediment on a Greek temple. Okay, so let's look at something else from Ur. So this is the standard of Ur. The reason it's called a standard is a little bit of a misnomer. So a standard is like a banner that was held on a pole going into battle. Okay, like if any of you watched Lord of the Rings, that's probably dated now, but you know, the House of Stark had their banner with their wolves, their dire wolves on it, and so they would ride holding that into battle so the other warriors would know where they were coming from, right? So the thought when this was first discovered was that it was some kind of standard that would have been held in battle, which is bizarre because this thing is heavy. It's wood inlaid with shell, lapis lazuli, and red limestone, but the guy who first discovered it was like, clearly this is for battling. It's not, so it's not really a standard. That's a little bit of a misnomer, but that's okay. It's kind of interesting to learn about how things get their names. So this thing was found in the royal cemetery of the ancient city of Ur. So this is modern Tel Makayar in Iraq. This is from about 2600 BC, and it's now in the British Museum. You'll notice on a lot of my slides, I note where these artifacts are located now, so that if you're in London and you go to the British Museum and you want to see this thing that I was talking about, you can go find it. Okay, so if you look at this, we're going to look at each of the sides separately now. And what this does is it has a war side and a peace side is how they're known. So on the top we have our war side, and here you can see we have these four-wheeled chariots, which are kind of odd. When we look at Roman artwork from Roman history, we'll see a lot of usually two-wheeled chariots. So we have these four-wheeled chariots, and they're not being drawn by horses, they're being drawn by donkeys. Not that that's super relevant, but just so you know, those are donkeys. And you can see the way you read this thing is left to right and bottom to top. So in the bottom row with these chariots, we have the donkeys and chariots trampling over people. Okay, so this is they're mowing down their enemies, they're running over their enemies. And then we see the row above is some of the enemies being taken prisoner. They've been stripped down. They're nude. This is for humiliation purposes, taking prisoners and humiliating them. And then up above, we have this larger central figure. That would be the king, okay? And so we have all the people paying homage to the king who's the conqueror. In the lower side, lower panel here, this is the peace side, we have scenes more typical of everyday life, okay? So we have our kind of agriculture people bringing supplies, and they have their livestock in the bottom two panels. So we have some music playing, we have some kind of festival or banquet where people are seated at the top. So we have our wartime and our peacetime designs embedded in this standard. Again, not really a standard. Okay, the next thing that we are going to do is kind of skip forward in history a little bit. And a lot of things, I seem like I'm leaving out important things for any of you who are have a knowledge of history from this time period. But a lot of that is because in the class you're assigned different things in discussions. So some of the topics and artifacts and things you will be assigned to teach us about in the discussion. Okay, so don't panic if I'm skipping your favorite Neo-Sumerian artifact. It's probably in the discussion. Okay, so to give a little context, in 2334 BC, the city-states known as Sumer become unified under this great ruler, and his name is Sargon of Akkad, to be specific. And Akkad is an ancient city that they've never actually found the ruins of, but they think it was near Babylon. We're going to talk about Babylon in a minute. So the Akkadians are also Semitic peoples. Semitic meaning that they're people from the Near East whose language is related to Hebrew and Arabic. So Semitic is just a kind of archaeological sort of grouping of peoples. And so their language is called Acadian. It's different than Sumerian spoken language, but they do adopt the cuneiform to write with the Sumerians use. So they adapt it to their Akkadian language. Okay, so this is the head of an Acadian king, and it sort of embodies this new concept of the absolute monarchy that is developed under Sargon. So we have this very powerful king figure, which comes up for the first time in this period, and we see a lot of art and writing and artifacts that reflect this shift. So instead of a bunch of scattered city-states with different rulers, we have one sort of supreme leader that it's thought he's described as being sort of godlike. Again, it is thought that these leaders are chosen by the gods at this time. The head is all that remains of this sculpture. It was probably quite large. It was probably lifelike. And it was destroyed when the city of Mediz sacked Nineveh in 612 BC, so the sculpture gets destroyed, the head is left, the head has been defaced, the beard is chopped off, the eyes have been gouged out, which were probably precious stones, and this was intentional to be insulting, but we still have this beautiful head left, which is pretty incredible when we think about the time period it was made. So we can see some pretty interesting things here. We can see that the sculptor is sort of balancing naturalism. So we have this very human proportional looking face, but it's being balanced with abstract patterning, right? So if we look at the beard, if we look at the hair and the way each of these sort of units of pattern gets repeated to represent the beard, that's not how a real beard looks, right? So this is kind of a higher conceptual idea about abstraction being applied. The other thing that's interesting about this is the technique. So this is a hollow bronze cast head. This is the earliest example of a cast sculpture we have. We're going to talk about casting in more detail when we talk about the Romans in a couple of weeks, so I'm not going to go into it too much now, but know that this is really advanced and really early for that kind of technology. Okay, the godlike authority of the Akkadian kings is also evident in some of the other artifacts of the time, like this stele. A stele is it's kind of like a pillar. It's a vertical carved representation. And this particular stele commemorates the victory of Naram-Sen over the Lulubai, which are people who come from the Iranian mountains. And this is very interesting because it's inscribed twice. So we have two separate carvings that have been done on this. Once for Naram-Sen And then again for the Elamite king who captures Sippar, he takes over the city where this originally was located. It's captured in 1157, and he takes this as kind of booty, as some of the artifacts and goods stolen from the city after it's defeated. And then this Elamite king decides to have his own story carved in this. So it's carved over twice, which is kind of interesting that it was used to depict two separate victories by two separate kings from two separate cultures. So it's kind of an interesting thing. We have our king in the middle. He's that largest figure. Oftentimes at this period, the king is depicted as larger than everyone else to show that they're important, that they're the central figure. And the king is also wearing this very interesting horned kind of helmet. And that is a symbol of being a deity, of being immortal. So he's showing his connection to the gods and that he's wearing this hat. Okay, King Hammurabi of Babylon is one of the most important people we'll talk about today. So King Hammurabi of Babylon formulates a comprehensive law code. So have you heard of the Code of Hammurabi in your civics class or your government class? You probably did at some point, but you maybe have forgotten it, or maybe you remember it. Maybe you're super into the Code of Hammurabi. Well, this is called the Code of Hammurabi because it was devised by a king named Hammurabi, and he's the king of a city called Babylon, which is a very important ancient city. So he creates this comprehensive law code for his people, and it tells you everything about how to treat your neighbor and your wife, to how to do business, and how to exact revenge on your enemy. It has everything very laid out very specifically. And this is the earliest set of written laws in history, and we don't see something similar until 1,000 years later in Greece. So this was really, really ahead of its time. And the code is written in Acadian, in cuneiform, so it has, you can see it's inscribed on this stele, and it is 3,500 lines of cuneiform, so it's quite extensive. The Hammurabi the king, reestablished a centralized government. So much of the region had returned to the city-state kind of divided sort of government in the centuries prior to his rule. But he comes around and unifies everything again. And I say unified, that sounds really pleasant. He wasn't super pleasant about it. He kind of conquered everybody and forced them to unify. So he's around from 1792 to 1750 BC. So he has a pretty good stretch. Okay, and on top of this, so in the bottom part, we have the Code of Hammurabi, the first written law. And then on the top, we have Hammurabi, and he has his hand that he's kind of raising up in a sign of respect. And he is face to face and about the same size as this god. Okay, so we know that this is a god because we can see these rays of light coming from his shoulders. And this is the god Shamash. Shamash is the god of the sun. He's the sun god, so he's one of the kind of top gods in Babylon. And so we have Hammurabi going up to him and having this interaction. And this is to establish that the laws of the Code of Hammurabi are bestowed from God to the king. So if anyone questions his code, his laws, he's setting it up in a narrative where he can say, well, then you're going against God, so obviously you're evil and I'm right because God's on my side. So that's why this is sort of establishing that kind of narrative. Okay, so the Babylonian Empire topples under the Hittites, and the Hittites are an Anatolian people who conquer Babylon in 1595 BC. Anatolian means they come from what is now modern-day Turkey. So if you see the word Anatolian, that means comes from the region that is now modern-day Turkey. So the Hittites sack Babylon, they take it over, and then they take off. They leave. And so then the Kassites take over Babylon. We're not going to talk about them a lot today. But basically the Hittites return to their homeland in what's modern-day Turkey. And they have this giant fortified city, which we're looking at a part of here. So this gate is part of the remains of the Hittites' heavily fortified capital city. It was kind of a citadel. And the city was constructed of heavy stone, and this is in contrast to in Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent, all of these societies, including Babylon, everything's made out of these bricks. So bricks made out of mud, out of fired mud, so easier to topple and crumble, whereas these guys are making everything out of really heavy fortified stone. And then they have their gate is guarded by these carved 7-foot tall lions, so that to sort of show their strength. Okay. While Hammurabi ruled Babylon, we have King Zimri-Lim, who is around from 1779 to 1757 BC, and he controls the Neo-Sumerian city-state of Mari, M-A-R-I. And in 1757, Hammurabi destroys the royal residence, which is located in Mari, and this was a giant palace, basically a giant palatial building, and inside it were tons of frescoes. What is a fresco? A fresco is a mural, basically. It's a painting on a wall, and we'll talk about different kinds of fresco if you take Art History 2 with me. There's fresco secco and fresco buono, but basically when they're putting the plaster up, the coating on the inside of the walls and the inside of the bricks inside the building, they're putting pigment and paint into it so that it becomes part of the wall and stays part of it. But basically, it's a painted mural on the wall. And this palace at Mari had tons of these, and they're almost all entirely destroyed. We have this fragment. There are a couple of other fragments, which is kind of miraculous that they survived. So this particular fresco represents the investiture of Zimri-Lim by Ishtar, which is the goddess who's in this depiction coronating him to rule. We've talked about Ishtar before. Ishtar was also Inanna. We looked at her marble head earlier. Okay, so this is just a drawing that shows what's happening in here. So to the east of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, the Elamites occupy what's now southern Iran. Elam appears in the Judeo-Christian Bible, and it appears pretty early in the Judeo-Christian Bible, if you know anything about the Old Testament or the Torah. It's mentioned, Elam is mentioned in Genesis 10:22, so that's the first book of that religious scripture. So right in the beginning, the city-state of Elam is mentioned. And Elam's records are some of the earliest examples of writing in the world. Okay, so we're going to talk some about the Elamites now. One of Elam's major cities was Susa, and it is destroyed by an Assyrian king called Ashurbanipal in 641 BC. In the ruins of Susa, a life-size bronze and copper statue is found, which is what this is an image of. They don't find its head. It's missing some pieces, but the majority of it is intact. And it depicts Queen Naper-Asu, who was wife of one of the most powerful Elamite kings, Utash-Napirisha. And this sculpture of Queen Naper-Asu weighs 3,700 pounds. So that's almost 2 tons. So this is life-size, so it's under 6 feet tall, and it weighs 2 tons, to give you an idea of how heavy this thing is. So later, when we talk about the Romans particularly, we're going to talk about bronze sculptures and why they're mostly cast hollow bronze. And one of the main reasons is so that they aren't super, super, super heavy. And this thing is extremely heavy because the interior core is bronze and then the outside is a cast copper shell. And this was intentional. She wanted her sculpture, because she has seen all the people who take over and conquest and things, they come in and destroy all the cultural artifacts of a society. And she didn't want this to happen. She wanted her image and her sculpture to survive forever. So it's literally inscribed in the skirt of the sculpture that with a curse, and the curse is for anyone who dares to attempt to move or destroy her statue. So it's often called the immovable statue of Queen Naper-Asu. And she got her wish. I mean, we've lost the head and one of the arms, but it still exists, mostly intact. So it's pretty crazy. And again, the casting technology for this time, it's very advanced. It's very ahead of its time. Okay, we're getting close to the end, I promise. I know this is sort of long. So Sargon II, Sargon II, created a palace, which one of you will tell us about in the discussion online. And guarding the gate to his palace were these colossal limestone lamassus. Lamassu. And a lamassu is another vocabulary word that you need, and that is a winged man-headed bull. And they are created as guardian figures to ward off enemies, and we're going to see them a lot in these Persian cultures in the Middle East. Okay, the Assyrian Empire was never very secure, and most of its kings had to defend their thrones against many revolts and people constantly coming in and trying to take them over. Neo-Babylonian kings held sway in the region until the Persian conquest. So the most renowned of the Neo-Babylonian kings was Nebuchadnezzar II, and he's around from 604 to 562 BC. And Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was a mud brick city, but it had this very standout feature, which is what we see in this image, and that is this blue glazed facade of the gates leading in to Babylon. This is a reconstruction of those gates, but they're called the Ishtar Gates, and they're one of the most important monuments from the region. And to describe what's going on here, we have Marduk. Marduk was the chief god of the Babylonians. We have his symbol is the dragon, this kind of golden dragon, and it's alternating with Adrad's bull. Adrad was the Babylonian god of storms and weather. So we have the bull and the dragon alternating on the Ishtar Gate leading up to the central, and then the central figures in here are the golden lion of Ishtar, which is why this is called the Ishtar Gate. Okay, so if you want to see this restored construction of this, you have to go to Berlin. It's no longer in the Middle Eastern region. Okay, a little more context here. So we have Cyrus of Persia, who captures Babylon in the 6th century, and he develops this grand palace structure, which is the most important source of knowledge about Persian art and architecture, and it's the ceremonial and administrative citadel at Persepolis. So this is Persepolis. These are some images of Persepolis. And it's built between 521 and 465 BC. Alexander the Great, we'll talk about him a lot later, comes along and razes, meaning he burns and destroys this site. He totally crushes it. And he did that because it's kind of a symbol of the Persian Empire and how great it is and how advanced it is in terms of society. So Alexander the Great, his main enemy are the Persians, and so he totally destroys Persepolis, but we do have some pieces of it that remain standing and have been excavated over time. So we have a monumental gate, which is called the Gate of All Lands, and that's what you're seeing images of in the top left and on the right here. And what are these figures? We have seen them before. These are the lamassu, right? The winged bull with the head of a man. We see these in Persian art throughout the centuries. We also have the remains of the Royal Audience Hall, which is called a Apadana, Apadana. So, and this Apadana is a great, huge hall. It was 60 feet high, which was just gigantic in these ancient times. I mean, it'd be gigantic now, but imagine it, when people are just beginning to build things out of, mud bricks, and here's this stone hall that's 60 feet high. It was 217 feet across, and it was square, so the diameter of both directions was 217 feet, and it had 36 colossal 60-foot high columns inside it. So this is a pretty substantial, kind of incredible architectural feat. The other thing we have in the remnants of Persepolis, which we can still see today, there are some of these carved relief friezes that are left somewhat intact. And it's really sad that our buddy Alex the Great destroyed most of this, because we could know even more about the Persian culture, because as you can see, these were quite detailed, really incredible relief sculptures. So we have a little bit of this, but not a ton of it remains. Okay, so we'll talk about Alexander the Great a little bit more. We're going to talk about him later when we get into his culture later, but Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia is in 330 BC, And it marks a long period of Greek and then Roman rule of what was previously the ancient Near East, what was previously the Persian Empire. But a new power called the Sassanians rises, and they create a new Persian Empire in 224 BC. So we're going to talk about the Greeks and the Romans and everybody later after this, so I'm going a little bit, we're just kind of staying in this region and going chronologically as to what happens there. Okay, so the Sassanians come up. We have Shapur I, and he's a Sassanian king who further extends the Sassanian territory and builds a gigantic palace, which you are seeing the remnants of here. The central feature is the Iwan, I-W-A-N, and that's this big curved hall here. So this is really remarkable in that this is what we call a barrel vault. So barrel vaults are something that we ascribe to the Romans as inventing and as being one of their chief inventions. And you'll see that this is not in Rome. And so this is something that's sort of unexpected in this region. We also have all these blind arcades. That means lots of arches repeating that aren't pierced with windows, that are just solid wall. So this is a clearly kind of Roman design. So it's very interesting to see in what is now modern day Iraq. Okay, so this is Shapur the First's palace, and this is just an engineering marvel, and it sets a precedent for future buildings in the Middle East. We have what we call an arabesque vault later, which is a vault that comes to a little bit of a point, or arches that come to a little bit of a point, and they're based heavily on this design. So it influences architecture in the region for many, many, many years to come. Okay, last thing that we're going to look at, and then we're done with Neolithic. Yay! Lastly, we have this splendid portrait of a Sassanian king. We don't know which one. Might be Shapur, we're not sure. Might be his son, Shapur II. And so this is a portrait of a Sassanian king, a sculptural relief portrait, and it is done entirely in silver. And this is sort of testifying or showing off the wealth of the Sassanian Empire and also their superb sculpting skills. I mean, this thing is pretty fantastic looking. This is not cast. We've looked at some early examples of casting. This is actually a technique called repensé. Repensé is something that we will talk about later when we get into the Middle Ages, because that's when it becomes really popular in what is now France. But this technique means you take a sheet of metal, in this case silver, and you've made something out of clay or carved out of wood that has the shape that you want it to take on. You take the piece of metal, you lay it on your carved surface, and then you hammer it. So you hit it with a hammer until it falls into those crevices and takes on the shape that you've carved in the softer material below. And that is how this was created. This was very, very, very early use of this technique, and we don't really see it used again for quite a while, so it's pretty interesting. And it's this very difficult technique of hammering something out of a single sheet of metal and making it look pretty flawless. So there's a lot of finishing that goes on in this. This is now at the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It's pretty fantastic. So it's silver, and then it's gilded in mercury. Gilded we usually associate with gold leaf, putting a thin layer of gold over a surface, often wood. In this case, it's silver that then they didn't know mercury was super poison for you, obviously. So they're shining it with mercury to make it even more shiny and silver. All right, that is it for the Neolithic rise of civilization in the Fertile Crescent. And next time, we're going to talk about the Egyptians, which is often a class favorite. So I will talk to you later.